He sold America the illusion of glamour. But what if the king of late-night television privately dismantled it? Did Johnny Carson quietly expose truths about classic Hollywood beauty that the studios never wanted repeated? Behind closed doors, under contracts built on perfection, 5 legendary actresses carried secrets no camera lens could soften. Tonight, we're stepping past the stage lights and into the controlled shadows of the studio system, where image was currency and reality was rewritten. One name on this list still makes insiders uncomfortable. Bette Davis. Hollywood sold her as sharp-eyed elegance, precision, ice-cold beauty. But here's the contradiction no studio publicity still ever admitted. Bette Davis was never cast for traditional glamour, and that terrified executives. Yet her eyes were considered too intense, too large, too unsoftened. In an era when actresses were powdered into porcelain dolls, Davis refused to chase that illusion, and that refusal created whispers. Cameramen complained she didn't photograph sweetly. Makeup artists fought her bone structure instead of enhancing it. Studio memos described her look as unconventional. That word was polite code. It meant not safely beautiful. So Warner Brothers did what studios did best. They engineered perception. Soft focus lenses, shadow-heavy lighting, strategic contouring, close-ups that captured power instead of prettiness. Off-camera, she looked like a working actress, sharp, angular, human, no glow, no halo. That gap between myth and reality became fuel for quiet industry jokes. Late-night hosts, including Carson years later, often joked broadly about studio magic, about how the camera could manufacture goddesses. But here's what makes Davis different. She weaponized the insult. She once famously said, "Hollywood always wanted me to be pretty. I fought for truth instead." And truth is harder to light. Producers feared she lacked box office face value. Executives debated replacing her early in her career. Some male co-stars privately called her plain. Yet when the camera rolled, she dominated the frame so completely that beauty became irrelevant. That contradiction is what fascinates historians today. Was she ugly off camera? Or was Hollywood so addicted to artificial femininity that anything real felt threatening? Here's the darker part. Studios understood that glamour sold fantasy, and fantasy required control. If audiences saw actresses without lighting, without powder, without orchestration, the spell weakened, so access was limited. Public appearances were staged. Photographers were supervised. Casual snapshots were discouraged. Not because these women were unattractive, but because imperfection breaks mythology. And Bette Davis, in raw daylight, looked like a woman who had lived. That was dangerous. By the time Carson ruled late-night television, the golden age illusion was already cracking. He represented a new era, casual, observational, mildly irreverent. He didn't need to attack actresses directly. All he had to do was joke about what makeup can do. Audiences filled in the blanks. But here's what the studios never predicted. The same qualities they once feared. Her severe lines, her lack of soft glamour, are exactly what make her timeless. And there's another actress on this list whose transformation off camera was so dramatic that insiders still argue about which version was real. She wasn't born glamorous. She was engineered, and the price of that engineering was written into a contract most people have never seen. Joan Crawford. She built a face the way other women built careers. And that's not an insult. It's a confession. Because before Joan Crawford became the polished, razor-cheekboned icon of MGM, she was Lucille Lesueur, a chorus girl executives quietly described as rough around the edges. That phrase again: polite, controlled, damaging. Studio insiders didn't think she had the right bone structure. Her jaw was considered too heavy. Her smile too wide. The executives wanted softened. So MGM did the executives wanted softened. So MGM did something radical. They didn't reject her. They redesigned her. Teeth reshaped, hairline altered, eyebrows redrawn higher to elongate the face. Strategic lighting developed specifically for her angles. Publicists rewrote her background to scrub away working-class origins. Even her name was replaced. Lucille Lesueur sounded ordinary. Joan Crawford sounded expensive. But here's where the whispers begin. Off-camera, without sculpted shadows and controlled cinematography, Crawford reportedly looked dramatically different. Photographers not under studio contract described her as intense, almost severe. Some said she appeared smaller than her screen presence suggested. Then others said the illusion dissolved the moment the lights dimmed. That gap between manufactured glamour and natural appearance fascinated industry insiders. By the time Johnny Carson dominated late-night television decades later, Hollywood had shifted. The mystique wasn't sacred anymore. Comedy thrived on puncturing inflated legends. Carson rarely named names in cruelty, but he often joked about the machinery of image-making, the wigs, the pancake makeup, the difference between Technicolor and kitchen lighting. And if there was ever an actress who embodied that transformation more than anyone else, it was Crawford. But here's what makes this darker. Crawford didn't just accept the illusion. She enforced it. Visitors to her home were reportedly required to see her fully composed, even at breakfast, even casually. She controlled angles instinctively. She knew which side photographed stronger. She monitored how she was perceived, not out of vanity, out of survival. Because she knew the truth. If the audience ever saw Lucille instead of Joan, the contract, both literal and psychological, could fracture. And in old Hollywood, once the illusion cracked, the studio didn't protect you. They replaced you. So was she ugly, off camera? Or was she simply human in a system that demanded porcelain perfection? The real scandal isn't whether she looked different in daylight. It's that the entire industry required difference to be hidden. Crawford's face became architecture, controlled, engineered, maintained. And that kind of maintenance creates tension. Because when beauty is built, it can collapse. There's another name on this list whose off-camera transformation was so dramatic that crew members reportedly did double takes when they saw her without the armor. No cheekbone sculpting, no controlled lighting, no myth. And when you learn what her studio contract required, the whispers about ugly start to sound like deflection, not truth. The next entry is where illusion becomes obsession, and obsession becomes cost. Marlene Dietrich. If Hollywood ever engineered a face into myth, it was hers. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Without lighting, without angles, without the architecture of shadow, the illusion dissolved. Marlene Dietrich didn't just use lighting. She controlled it like a weapon. Directors didn't light her. They submitted to her. She demanded specific diffusion filters. She insisted on gauze over lenses. She understood exactly how cheekbones caught shadow. She studied the way light grazed her jawline. She knew where darkness erased imperfection. Because she knew something the studios didn't want audiences thinking about. Her face was cinematic, not casual. Crew members later admitted that seeing her without the carefully constructed glow was jarring. Not because she was unattractive, but because the mystique vanished. The cheekbones that sliced through shadows softened in daylight. The hypnotic eyes looked smaller without strategic framing. The lips, without contrast lighting, felt ordinary. Ordinary. That word again. Dangerous in an era built on worship. Dietrich's entire brand depended on transcendence. She wasn't meant to look like someone you'd pass on the street. She was meant to look like someone carved from smoke. So she protected that illusion ruthlessly. No candid photos, no harsh daylight interviews. She positioned herself away from overhead lighting. She refused certain camera angles outright. Assistants reportedly monitored press photography to prevent unapproved images. And this is where late-night mythology enters. By the time Johnny Carson was hosting Hollywood royalty on The Tonight Show, the golden era mystique had started to crack. Audiences were more cynical. Comedy had teeth. Carson frequently joked about how stars looked different without studio magic. He teased the machinery, not always the individual. The humor worked because the audience suspected what wasn't said out loud. But Dietrich was never the punchline. She was the example, because insiders knew her beauty was inseparable from cinematography. And that's not an insult. It's revelation. Hollywood taught the world to believe beauty was natural when, in truth, it was engineered under 10,000 watts of heat. Dietrich leaned into that engineering harder than anyone. But there's a darker undertone. The obsession with light became extreme. She reportedly toured with her own lighting setup in later years. She understood that one wrong shadow could expose fatigue. One uncontrolled angle could flatten the mystique. Imagine living like that. Imagine knowing the world worships a version of you that exists only in carefully curated light. So when whispers circulated that she looked different off camera, the question isn't whether they were true. The question is why the industry framed different as deficiency. The real betrayal wasn't that actresses looked human without lighting. It's that the studios convinced audiences humanity was failure. And there's another name on this list who didn't rely on shadow to sculpt her face. She relied on softness. And when that softness faded, the studio system didn't protect her. It repositioned her. And the public believed the transformation was natural. It wasn't. The next story isn't about shadows. It's about fragility and what happens when the camera stops forgiving. Greta Garbo. She was sold as untouchable, a face so luminous it barely felt human, a woman who wanted to be alone, preserved in stillness, framed in silence, elevated into something close to myth. But here's the contradiction that made studio executives nervous. Without the camera, without the sculpted stillness, Greta Garbo looked like a private citizen. No halo, no glow. Meet just a woman walking down a street. Garbo's mystique wasn't built on sparkle. It was built on restraint, the stillness, the pause before a line, the way her face absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Cinematographers adored her because she understood shadow. She turned slightly, lowered her gaze, let darkness define the cheekbones. But that alchemy required precision. Raw daylight was less forgiving. Unfiltered photography flattened the angles that made her ethereal. Casual snapshots captured her mid-expression, unguarded, uncomposed. And that was the version the public was never meant to see. MGM knew the risk. Garbo's brand depended on distance. Interviews were rare. Public appearances were controlled. Even publicity images were carefully staged to preserve the mystique. The fewer people saw of her in ordinary settings, and the more powerful the illusion became. Because mystique is fragile. It survives only if mystery remains intact. By the time Johnny Carson became the king of late-night irreverence, Hollywood's older generation had already started retreating. The studio system was weakening. Audiences were growing curious about the machinery behind legends. Carson didn't need to attack Garbo directly. He represented a new era, conversational, observational, gently deflating. And the very existence of that tone was dangerous to someone like Garbo, because her entire mythology required distance. Here's the part people misunderstand. When rumors circulated that Garbo looked different off-camera, it wasn't a scandal. It was a structural vulnerability. She didn't look otherworldly at the grocery store. She looked quiet, reserved, human. And that humanity threatened the brand MGM spent millions cultivating. So what did she do? She disappeared, retired early, avoided publicity, refused the modern celebrity circuit, preserved the last frozen image of herself in the public mind, young, luminous, remote. That choice wasn't vanity. It was strategic containment. Because once audiences see the goddess buying bread, the contract shifts. Was she ugly off camera? Or was she simply no longer bathed in orchestration? The truth is colder than the rumor. Hollywood trained audiences to mistake lighting for destiny. Garbo understood that better than anyone. And when she sensed the light changing, culturally, technologically, psychologically, she stepped away before the myth could erode. But there is one final name, and this one is different. Because unlike the others, she didn't retreat from the illusion. She fought it. And the studio's response wasn't subtle. It was quiet, strategic, devastating. And when you hear what insiders said about her appearance in private meetings, you'll understand why this story refuses to fade. Number 1 isn't about lighting. It's about control and who lost it. Barbara Stanwyck. She wasn't supposed to be beautiful. That's the secret. While other actresses were sculpted into porcelain icons, Barbara Stanwyck built a career on something far more dangerous: authenticity. No mystique campaign, no engineered halo, no lighting obsession written into contracts. And that unsettled the system. Because Stanwyck did not photograph like a fantasy. She photographed like a force. Her face had strength in it, hard lines, sharp intelligence. It's a kind of presence that didn't need softness to command the frame. Cinematographers didn't blur her into dreaminess. They let her cut through scenes with clarity. But here's what studio executives whispered behind closed doors: she's not a glamour girl. In old Hollywood language, that wasn't casual commentary. It was a ceiling. She didn't fit the ethereal mold of Garbo. She didn't sculpt light like Dietrich. She didn't architect her features like Crawford. She didn't weaponize unconventionality like Davis. She simply existed. And without heavy glamour styling, she looked like a real woman of her era, which, ironically, made her more believable and more threatening to the illusion machine. Because once audiences connect with authenticity, fantasy loses control. See, by the time Johnny Carson was reshaping Hollywood interviews into relaxed, mildly irreverent conversations, the culture had already shifted. The curtain was thinning. Late-night humor made the machinery visible. Carson didn't need to name actresses. The joke lived in implication. That old Hollywood beauty was less about genetics and more about wattage. Stanwyck fit awkwardly into that narrative. She wasn't transformed by light in extreme ways. She didn't rely on filters to create mythology. Off-camera, she looked consistent. And that consistency exposed something uncomfortable. The industry's definition of beauty was never universal. It was curated. And Stanwyck's refusal to be curated into fragility meant she often played women with power, cynicism, intelligence. The camera didn't soften her. It revealed her. Some insiders later admitted that executives struggled to categorize her. Not glamorous enough for certain roles. Too strong for others. Not easily reduced to ornament. Which is precisely why she endured. Here's the deeper truth no viral headline captures. The rumor that classic actresses were ugly, off-camera, says more about the studio system than about the women. Hollywood built beauty as spectacle. Controlled lighting, precision contouring, carefully staged publicity. Remove those layers, and you didn't get ugliness. You got reality. And reality is dangerous in a business built on illusion. The contradiction at the heart of this entire story isn't whether these actresses looked different in daylight. Of course they did. Everyone does. The real revelation is that the illusion was so powerful, so carefully guarded, that even decades later, the audiences still search for confirmation that the magic was fake. But here's the open question that lingers. If the camera created the myth, and late-night culture slowly dismantled it, who truly exposed Hollywood beauty? Was it Carson's era of irreverent commentary? Or was it the women themselves, aging, unfiltered, unguarded, refusing to disappear? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't flattering to the studios. Because once you understand how thoroughly beauty was manufactured, you can't unsee it, and that realization lingers longer than any punchline ever could. They sold perfection. They protected illusion, and when the lights dimmed, reality felt like betrayal. Johnny Carson didn't destroy the myth. He lived in the era that exposed it. The truth isn't that these women were ugly. It's that Hollywood manufactured worship. And once you see the machinery behind beauty, the fantasy never feels the same again.